everyone, it's Sevi. Even though I already discussed some of Faruzan's issues in my initial guide video of her, I wanted to do a more in-depth analysis of her kit's problems. Her main issues can be broken down into three aspects: energy, gameplay mechanics, and constellation dependence, which are all somewhat related. Why do they exist in the first place? Are they really that bad? And what would I change if I could? These are questions I aim to expound on in this video. To make it clear, I think Faruzan is usable and valuable as an Anemo support, even at low constellations, and I'm not telling you to never consider building her if you don't have her at C6. Rather, this is going to be a case study relating to build and gameplay optimization, and if you don't care enough for those things, that's totally fine and you should still enjoy her nonetheless. But even then, there may be lessons and points that are useful to know for the average player. With that in mind, let's get started. First, we'll do a quick recap on why energy and energy recharge are important, as they're related to Faruzan's big problem. As we all know, Genshin characters have an elemental burst, which most of the time is a very important part of their moveset to maximize their role. Faruzan is one such unit where almost her entire support utility is locked behind her burst. With it, she's able to shred Anemo resistance over time and buff your team's Anemo damage, which are rare, thus making them quite valuable to give a big boost to Anemo damage. Without her burst, she only has her skill and charge shot to create a pressurized collapse, which has very little support utility. Basically, if Faruzan isn't using her burst, then she's not doing much. Faruzan's burst costs 80 energy, which is on the higher end. Characters recharge their energy mainly by catching energy particles, with differences on the type of particle, if it's a different element, and if it's caught on-field or off-field. The higher their energy recharge, or ER stat, the faster they can regenerate energy, making ER a very important and, more often than not, an underrated stat. This is why a unit's particle generation is helpful to know, as that's one indicator of how much ER is recommended to build for a unit. So what's Faruzan's particle generation rate? Her pressurized collapse will generate 2 Anemo particles on hit. Unfortunately, 2 Anemo particles isn't much. At C0 she needs that and a lot more to satisfy her burst cost. Some characters can generate a lot more particles, sometimes by using their skill more than once during a rotation like Bennett, or by having a consistent particle generation over time like Fischl's Oz. However, it's quite impractical to make Faruzan generate her own particles multiple times over one rotation. That's because of the on-field time with the Anemo DPSes that she's meant to support. Wanderer and Xiao have pretty long field times due to their special state durations, and if you switch out in the middle of them, it will prematurely end and result in a potential DPS loss. Heizo is the only one among them that doesn't exactly rely on having a special state, so there's actually more flexibility to switch back and forth with Faruzan. But generally, since Faruzan cannot be conveniently switched in and out with Wanderer and Xiao, she's mostly getting energy particles from off-field, which doesn't give back as much energy compared to catching them on-field. And there's less of a good opportunity to generate her own particles, which practically limits her sources of energy. So how does one ensure that she can still burst on cooldown to create a smooth, continuous rotation? The first and essential solution is to build enough ER. However, at C0 to C5, her average ER stat recommendation can actually go as high as 300%. That's an absurdly high amount. In order to obtain it, the build would strictly require an ER Sans, an ER weapon, and a lot of ER substats or 2-piece ER artifact sets. And to add insult to injury, her Ascension stat isn't even ER, but attack. She could have been made to ascend on the stat she really needs, but nope. To do a practical demonstration, here's an energy test with a Wanderer Faruzan Bennett Zhongli team. Faruzan is on C2 and 270% ER, and no Favonius weapon users in the team. The goal is to have enough energy to restart the rotation continuously without unnecessarily extending it. Mago Kenki simulates a worst-case scenario for energy generation, as he drops very few energy particles. I also made sure that her pressurized collapse hits to generate particles, and that she stayed to catch them on-field herself, otherwise that would make her energy recharging worse. And as we can see, by the time I need to restart, her energy falls noticeably short. Even if I were to catch the particles she generates, it's still not enough. This is already at 270% ER. If I also had missed any of her pressurized collapses or didn't catch particles on field, then her energy would have been much lower too, which could happen in normal gameplay. Of course, there are some fixes to help with her ER needs. One is to include an energy generating equipment like a Favonius weapon on a teammate and or on Faruzan herself. With my Magu Kenki sample, equipping a Favonius weapon could be the push needed to get her burst back up on cooldown. Another solution is to add a third Anemo unit in the team for an extra source of Anemo particles. However, this also greatly reduces your team's flexibility as it now occupies 3 Anemo slots in the team, and that's also not often the best team composition in many other scenarios. Another is to just battle hordes of enemies that will drop a lot of particles or enemy types that give more particles than usual. In the overworld or certain spiral abyss floors where it's easy to kill monsters and find large enemy mobs, this is more doable. But when you're up against harder bosses, you have to rely more on your team's own means of generating particles and ER stats. In terms of rotation and gameplay, there are further ways to work around her energy issue. One is to just settle for only bursting every other rotation. This significantly lowers her ER requirement, but that means half the time, Faruzan isn't doing as much as she could for the team, and it ultimately results in a DPS loss. The second option is to spend more time generating energy to recharge Faruzan's burst if it's not ready yet. The trade-off is that it extends the rotation unnecessarily, and it could simply be avoided if her energy mechanics were a bit more generous. To be fair, Faruzan's element-specific support peers also have high energy demands, but in comparison, their energy issues aren't as bad for a couple of reasons. Kujo Sara is naturally paired with an Electro, which already unlocks Electro Resonance to add additional particle generation, and quite often she's paired with Raiden Shogun, who is a powerful battery. Goro technically generates 2 particles on his skill hit and has an 80 burst cost, but it's also not as bad since he's naturally comped with 3 or 4 Geo member teams, so he ends up having a lot of Geo particle sources. So despite the similar burst costs, Faruzan still stands out. It's not an exaggeration to say that Faruzan at low constellations will very likely be the most energy demanding unit in any team she's in. But my second biggest gripe is not just what her energy needs are, but also how she generates energy in her gameplay. I really don't like it when a unit is required to do charged shots in order to generate energy particles. I personally find it a very clunky mechanic, and while it's not impossible to do with Faruzan, I find it more often frustrating to work with. Admittedly, I'm not the best gamer in the world, so I know there are those who don't mind, or for some reason would like the added challenge. I'm not one of them. I find that tying particle generation behind this method is highly unnecessary. The standard method for generating particles is simply for the character's skill to hit. This is modified with certain characters like Wanderer, who activates their skill, then does their attacks to generate particles. Another recent example is Layla, who fires her stars to periodically generate particles, but creating stars is at least automatic. Kujo Sara was the first to implement having her particle generation tied to her charged shot mechanics. She has to first use her skill, then do a charged shot which creates a crow feather on impact, which then has to hit an enemy in order to generate 3 electro particles. I don't know how many players aren't fans of this mechanic, but I'd assume it's a lot, especially among mobile and controller gamers. I appreciate Hoyo trying to experiment with different mechanics, but I think Sara should have been an indicator that this was not a good thing to continue. Personally, I believe supports shouldn't have mechanics that feel too intrusive or unnecessarily extra, that can even risk you getting hit or staggered, unless you have a shielder or resistance to interruption buff. Can Faruzan skip her charged shots? Technically, yes. In fact, there is actually no crucial utility offered by the charged shot's pressurized collapse. Her vortex isn't anything to brag about, and her long-term Anemo resistance shred comes from her burst. In fact, I think her charged shot's biggest utility is to generate particles for herself. But if you decide not to generate her own particles, that would end up raising her ER requirement even more. Personally, I would just detach her particle generation from her charged shot mechanics. In fact, any future character should just really not have those two things tied anymore, unless maybe the charged shot is more instantaneously ready and or if it has more useful utilities. Instead, having her skill cast hit should be enough to trigger the particle generation. Faruzan's whole combination of making her main utility dependent on her burst, but then giving her clunky and low particle generation, which then leads to very high ER requirements or sacrificing some of her burst uptime, is what I personally find frustrating. I want to stress again that she is still usable at C0. I'm not one of those people who will tell you to not build her at C0 or if you don't have C6, because if you really want an Anemo support buffer, she still offers a lot of utility even at low cons. In fact, if I were to compare her overall utilities to her peers, I'd have some good things to say. Sarah has particular synergies with Raiden specifically, but otherwise, until she reaches C6, there's nothing in her kit that actually makes her feel tailor-made to support electro units, specifically since she only really gives an attack buff. Faruzan, on the other hand, has very valuable Anemo-specific buffs straight out of the box at C0, which kind of makes her closer to Goro, who also has strong Geo and defense-specific buffs by default. However, I can't sugarcoat her issues. She has workable gameplay, and her support is valuable even at low constellations. It's just not the experience that I think it should have been. There's already been a lot of talk about her C6 solving so many of these concerns, and it's not wrong. Aside from the Anemo crit damage buff, her ER requirement goes way down to manageable levels and even turns her into a pretty good Anemo battery for Wanderer or Xiao. This also lets you just forget doing charged shots, her clunkiest gameplay aspect, which is obviously a win. It even makes a whole new artifact set viable for her when it previously wasn't. C6 feels so good because it places all the utilities that were originally from her skill into her burst and creates new kit synergies without Faruzan even needing to do anything on field except cast it. If I were to trace how much her constellations change her overall kit and gameplay, the change with C6 is very drastic. Compare this to Sarah and Goro. They actually don't have as much utility locked behind their C6. Literally the only thing their C6 gives is their element-specific crit damage increase, and their C1 to C5 constellations offer quality of life improvements to their functions. But I don't view this to mean that Faruzan has a great C6. Rather, it means Faruzan has too much locked behind her C6. Essentially, she's a worse and more expensive case. I would even say she's a step backwards in constellation design, which might be apropos considering she's canonically from a century ago. It feels unfair to lock this much power behind a 4-star's final constellation when Sarah and Goro's C6 had the right balance of a sweet bonus, but not broken that it fixes issues that seem deliberately constructed. But I think we can guess why Faruzan is made that way. Some might say that pulling for constellations should just be taken as a given. While that is true to some extent for 4-stars, the fact that there is no pity for 4-stars and that the Star Glitter shop has never changed to get newer 4-stars added into it means that it's unreliable to assume that everyone can just easily get 4-star constellations. And even then, I don't think that the value of 4-star constellations should be skewed so drastically the way Faruzan C6 is. I do have some ideas as to how to edit her kit and constellations. Take these as wishful thinking, as we really shouldn't expect any more changes with how Faruzan was released. Hopefully though, future characters can learn from her design issues. First, I would build her C4 into her base kit so that she has some flat energy generation there. She already has very poor particle generation, why not alleviate it even just a tiny bit by making C4 inherent already? I think that would have been a reasonable default. Then I would remove her C1 effect completely because quite frankly, it's pretty useless. There's no incentive to have to do 2 charge shots in a row, especially due to her particle generation cooldown. Saving 1 charge shot for later is very unnecessary when her skill has a 6-second cooldown anyway too. What it could be changed into is to make her charge shot instantaneous instead of her default 60% charging time reduction. That way, if you do want her to use her charge shot, it alleviates more of its clunkiness. I would also add a constellation that slightly increases the suction power of her pressurized collapse, much like Heizo C2. Whether she's supporting Wanderer, Xiao, or Heizo, they would all benefit from better grouping mechanics from Faruzan, especially with Wanderer or Xiao, who don't have any innate grouping mechanics while dealing AoE damage. Of course, I would want her C6's off-field pressurized collapse procs to already be part of her base kit, but I'm sure some would say that would make her overpowered at C0 already. Obviously, we can't have nice things, and okay, it's a business model after all. If that's the case, I would make it a 2nd constellation at most and maybe move her original C2 as C4. This allows it to be achievable enough for free-to-play players and makes her a much easier support to recommend even at low constellations. And so her C6 would then be, like Sarah and Goro, just tied to increasing the crit damage of her respective element. Again, there's practically no chance that Faruzan will get any changes to her kit, but I really hope that her gameplay, energy, and constellation-related issues won't pop up again in a future support. I want characters to feel like they're getting progressively better to play, not clunkier and more expensive. And unfortunately, I don't think that was the case with our latest 4-star. Anyway, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about Faruzan's kit and how you would like to see it adjusted for a better experience. And let me know if you like these type of analysis videos as well, and maybe I'll do more of these in the future. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!